The governor spends time at a veterans home while primary races for the governor's office heat up. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect your life. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Mark Maxwell, Bureau Chief for the Capitol Bureau for WCIA Television. Welcome, Mark.
Bruce, thanks for having me.
Also, Hannah Meisel, writer for Law 360. Welcome, Hannah.
Glad to be here.
Well, the big news this week, among other things, seems to be that Governor Bruce Rushton spent how many days at the Veterans Home out in Quincy?
A whole week.
A full week he spent. And he emerged yesterday, the day before, saying we need to get more stuff done, but we're on the right path. This comes after a lengthy amount of press, most of it negative, about the governor's response to outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease at the Veterans Home in Quincy. Mark or Hannah, you all just toss this up. How much, if at all, did this week-long visit to the Veterans Home, where he drank the water, he stayed in the beds, he played board games, I guess, with the residents, and he ordered them all pizza on his final night? How might this have repaired his image on this issue, if at all?
You know, I think spending an entire week did do a lot. You know, I tend to think of a publicity stunt, which, you know, some accuse the governor of at the outset, as inviting a bunch of cameras in and, you know, just having it be a stage set for you. But, you know, he spent the entire week there. He didn't have any media availabilities until Wednesday when he was done with his week. And, you know, he really interacted with the residents. He got to know the science, and you really heard that in his speech on Wednesday. He seems very invested in this issue. Now, whether or not it makes up for, I mean, obviously, it would never make up for the deaths and the illnesses of the people who, you know, were affected by Legionnaire's disease, or the families. But whether it spurs real action remains to be seen. You know, the governor said, you know, we're going to get this taken care of as soon as possible. But then he mentioned, basically in the same breath, a task force. And task force are notoriously slow and deliberate and sometimes just don't get a lot done. He also, when he was asked about specific money, you know, he said we can't even talk about money yet because, you know, we have to develop a plan first. And money, of course, is tight. We have political realities of the upcoming session, and it remains to be seen what will actually come of this, but at least he did do some work to repair his image on this, because he did not look good going into last week.
Well, the governor may have snatched a stalemate from the jaws of defeat in this case, but if there are PR students or political consultants, this is a master class in taking a crisis, a political landmine, and turning it into the best possible thing he could. This is his lemons out of lemonade, or rather, lemonade out of lemons. And the governor stepped into the Veterans Home and did all those things you just said. But he also did say that he went down to the Blessing Hospital in Quincy, the local hospital there, and negotiated faster turnaround times for testing of patients. And when in the past they had to wait 3, 4, 5 days to find out if someone was infected with Legionella bacteria, now he says those tests can be done on site. They can get them done right away. That's a real difference that happens now. The question that Governor Rushton's critics will continue to bring up until the November election, perhaps even beyond, is why did it take 2.5 years and a media investigation to preempt or to spur that action? Why didn't Governor Rushton's staff do that on day one? And there have been critics of the governor who have said he's been indecisive in times of crisis, and there's been waffling or uncertainty. You can't accuse him of that in this instance because he's an election year incumbent, and he knows that there's nothing, very little at least, that aggravates voters more than knowing that our veterans have been left behind or haven't been treated with the utmost care. So he definitely saw this as a crisis, and he took time to jump into this. There are some that accused him of running a publicity stunt. But if I can just read you one quote from the initial WBEZ investigation from a family member of one of the veterans who died. Deanne French said Governor Rushton should go back over there and he should drink some of the water. Maybe he should take a shower. Maybe he should eat off of one of those plates coming out of that kitchen. maybe that would make an impact on him. So when his opponents say, you're just engaging in a political publicity stunt, that may be true. He's also doing exactly what one of the veterans' family members suggested he do. So it's hard to say that that's not worthwhile.
Nobody, so insofar as we know, nobody has lost their job over this at this point in time, to this point in time. Does that suggest that the governor is saying, by virtue of hey, no heads have rolled, that we've handled this as best we can? I mean, what are we to interpret from that?
Well, we don't have to interpret anything because he spelled it right out. He said our team took strong, decisive, and immediate action. And he says that in 2015 they acted, they got the CDC's blessing and approval. He says in 2016, when more Legionella bacteria were found and more people were sickened, same thing. He points to the health experts who have come out and given their inspection and given their full reports, and he is not backing away from or apologizing for the steps they took. Now, there still will be the question, why didn't he then do all the things he's doing now? And that's the political reality, that he saw this story as potentially damaging and knew he had to pull out all the stops and invest a full week, hunker down, and really change the narrative around this.
Right, and when reporters asked him on Wednesday, Governor, why didn't you do this so much sooner? Why didn't, you come here and stay and, understand the science so much sooner? And he said, we just followed what the best available advice that the experts were telling us. And I believe it was last week, the governor got hammered a bit when he said, these things happen about Legionella because it's a form of pneumonia. It's something that you're infected when you breathe the air droplets that are infected with the Legionella bacteria. And so it is pretty common. It's just that older people are going to be more vulnerable, just as they're more vulnerable to, traditional pneumonia. And so I think his reaction this past week, doing all the work, understanding all of the health risks, and then trying to shore up funding, like Mark said, going to the hospital nearby and striking up a deal, those are effective steps. But and he can fall back on, we did what we did, and it was the best available advice at the moment.
Sure. I think part of the question here is what would have been reasonable to have done on an earlier point in time? And I for one did not realize, perhaps I haven't read the coverage as closely enough, that it was taking the hospital as long as it did to come back with results on testing of these vulnerable folks. So perhaps it's fair to ask, was that something that should have been handled sooner than it was? But what about something like the plumbing? Now the governor is saying we're going to spend a whole bunch of money here on infrastructure to try to get this problem solved. Senator Dick Durbin has weighed in saying that the federal government needs to work with the state to get this accomplished. Was it reasonable? Would it have been reasonable to say after the first outbreak, we're going to replace the plumbing? We're going to do, they did spend a significant amount of money then. What would have been reasonable in terms of infrastructure alone?
Well, it probably would not have been a priority only because it didn't have the accompanying media, the negative or damaging media saying this is a current crisis. And you have to rewind back to 2015 at the onset of a budget battle. This probably would not have had the same leverage, but all of the ingredients came together at the right time. The budget battle is now behind us. We're going into an election year, and bam, there's this big damaging story. You expressed some hesitation that perhaps this might not get all the votes it needs because Springfield has that negative tone. But really, when you listen to all the lawmakers at the hearing earlier on Tuesday, it seems to me every politician in the state is lining up for a chance to say, I was part of the solution. You probably don't have anything with more bipartisan support right now in Illinois than doing something to help those veterans and any other veterans around the state. So if there's a bill to be passed, if there's a spending package, Governor Rauner mentioned even private funds could be raised for this solution. The current cost estimate to fix those pipes, $25 to $30 million. The cost to completely rebuild a home, another suggestion, that could be a lot more. But the question is, will the political will be there? My guess would be probably.
Well, $25–30 million, that's not a whole bunch of money in terms of the scheme of things. That money would be forthcoming. What if it isn't? Is there any chance that this suddenly or somehow morphs from what it is now into a political football come funding time? I mean, is this something that anybody should be concerned about, or is there bipartisan will to actually spend the money it takes to get this solved?
I mean, you'd hope not, because these are actual real people's lives, and more than that, they're veterans, and that's something that most people hold in the highest esteem. So could it turn into a political football? I'd guess that the most likely thing is that people are very willing to spend the money. It's not that much in the grand scheme of things. But timing, how fast this can get done, I'm not so sure.
Sure.
It's hard to identify the opposition in that fight. Who stands up and opposes spending money in this case? I can't think of anyone yet who would.
Sure. I mean, now that the governor has spent the week, is this becoming yesterday's news, or is there more to see here?
Well, there are political candidates who are looking to make this a signature moment, a signature failing. I think back to the day this story dropped, I believe it was December 12th. The very next morning, J.B. Pritzker, his running mate, and a fellow alderman from Chicago had a press conference, an open-air press conference in the middle of the city, and said Governor Rauner lied to us in 2016 when he was on top of this issue. He has since continued to run attack ads. One of them is titled Quincy. The entire message here is that Governor Rauner dropped the ball, veterans are dead, he has a moral responsibility, and J.B. Pritzker called for two things in particular. He said people should be fired, someone should be fired, and veterans should be moved out of that home. Now, Governor Rauner has said that's not an option. We're going to do everything we can to protect the home here. And he also implied through his other public statements that no one's going to lose their job and that they actually did the right thing. So, yeah, there are going to be politicians who will try to extend this story well into the campaign season. We know that because of these attack ads and because of the obvious political damage that could come from the perception that veterans were ignored.
Yeah. On the campaign trail, or shortly after being elected, the governor had said, I'm willing to take the arrows. I'll take the arrows on stuff that's not popular. And since then, he's been criticized for making excuses. This isn't my fault. This is Mike Madigan's fault. It's systemic stuff. Is he taking arrows here finally? And if so, how well is he doing it?
Well, yesterday he was directly asked, does the buck stop with you? And he didn't directly answer, as he is wont to do. Firing someone would make a direct statement. And I see parallels here. President Obama was criticized in 2013 when the ACA website rollout was pretty much a disaster, and he didn't, right away fire Kathleen Sebelius, who was the head of HHS. And he was hammered on that because firing someone, you hate it. It's terrible. It might not even be completely fair, but in the public's eyes, that's what justice is.
Well, it does two things that are damaging to a candidate as well, if you're talking from perspective, or from perception in the public eye, rather. And that is that, one, it validates the crisis. It validates that there were mistakes made. And in cases like this, when there's current lawsuits pending, you don't necessarily want to give that ground away to say, yes, there were errors made, and yes, we are liable. That's one factor. The second is just look at what happened when the governor fired most of his staff in July. When you fire people that are ambitious in a political world, you might just make an enemy out of them. And if you want someone going to the press and leaking damaging stories about you and having that story continue, well, just fire the person that was in the hot seat making those decisions while you were off campaigning or something else. So those are two factors to consider, that loyalty factor. When you fire someone in the political world, you may be laying a trap for yourself down the road. And that's something a lot of politicians in Springfield these days are very mindful of.
The Diane Rickert scenario.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's a really good point, because the governor has not had a great year, last year, 2017, and into this year with his former employees, the people that he was formerly closest to. You've seen a lot of leaks to the press. And you wouldn't want that coming back to bite you, especially, as Mark mentioned, in a lawsuit scenario. You don't want to admit fault before your day in court, if that ever happens, or, negotiations or for a settlement, because you don't want to admit fault there if that's where you're going.
Sure, but not on the other hand, the cap on damages on this is $100,000 per case. There's 13 that have been filed. That's 1.3 million. That's, it's not politically the best answer, but you could just pay them all $100,000 and close the case, couldn't you? And then the issue doesn't go away. So I'm wondering if there's a difference here between admitting fault and if you have more wiggle room to do that than if the case had been an actual circuit court as opposed to the court of claims, i.e. Assuming the state in this is a much different animal than if it had been a private entity involved.
That's a good question. I'm not sure the legal power the governor would have to just grant sign the check, so to speak, to give that $100,000 to the 13 families suing the state for negligence. You might know the answer to that question. I'm not sure if he's even allowed to do that with state funds.
I'm not sure where the executive would stand on that. Because it's different than a private entity who has total freedom. I'm not sure if he would have to get legislative approval.
Right, but if you're a private hospital that had been sued for something like this, you're really worried because you could be paying out millions and millions on a single claim.
They'd be motivated to settle that quickly for a smaller amount. The state's in a very different situation.
Right. Absolutely. We did mention Diane Rickard, and perhaps we should visit that just for a second here. She is the former communications specialist for the governor, who infamously said, as a white male, I think she was the one that put out that statement in the wake of some of the racial strife elsewhere. Actually in Illinois and elsewhere. She is now sued under the Freedom of Information Act, seeking records on the First Lady's weigh-ins on the abortion issue. How big of an issue might this be? I mean, we have two things, I think. One, the governor there's the argument, has been less than transparent. Two, what's in those emails? How big of a thing could this turn out to be?
Well, I can tell you from some conversations with people close. So two things were going on. This was the Illinois Policy Institute, sort of the scab employees that came in for about 6 weeks in the summer. They were there for very, they were there, they're going to hate that term.
That's fine.
They were there for two significant issues. It was the end of the school funding battle when Governor Rauner issued his mandatory veto and then eventually signed the school funding. And then when he signed HB 40. And according to sources who were inside the room when the governor informed his staff he intended to sign that bill to expand taxpayer funding of abortion, Christina Rasmussen, his new chief of staff, and Diana Rickard's close friend and boss, broke down in visible tears. And this was very upsetting for her and for Diana Rickard. Their suspicion, and the suspicion of some social conservatives, has long been that known Democrat Diana Rauner, the governor's wife, was influential and again, she's been pro-choice all along. They've donated to, whether it's Personal PAC or to Planned Parenthood, I can't recall, but I believe they've donated to Planned Parenthood for sure. So they believe that the First Lady was instrumental in pressuring the governor to sign this bill. What I can also tell you is
that... So she did it via email?
Well, the email may be a way to trap the governor's other option, because the governor was presented the week before he signed that bill an amendatory veto. It was crafted by Representative Peter Breen. And from what I'm told, it was actually a sort of pro-choice bill. It gave him an option to compromise, and he rejected that in favor of the all-out just signing this bill and getting it over with.
Which is actually contrary to what the governor said right after he signed the bill. He said, I tried to compromise with both sides, and it just didn't work, so I signed it.
Well, they took arrows again then, in some sense or form. He could have, quote-unquote, punted with an amendatory veto, and it would have devolved.
Well, and he had, and what I can tell you is he had that option. Yeah. It was emailed to the governor's staff. That very well may be the response to that option, may be what Diana Rickard is after, the conversation around the margins. It's hard to say exactly. We don't know. But here we have Diana Rickard, who's gone back to the Liberty Justice Center, which is the legal arm of the Illinois Policy Institute, and she's now waging a personal battle. Which is interesting, because some other people might give a tip to a reporter and say, hey, go after this. But she doesn't mind, even though it may blunt the impact of her personal attack because it's a political grudge and people are going to view it through that lens. She doesn't care. She thinks that whatever's behind those emails are so damaging that she's going to go after them anyways. And so she's going to see if she can drag this out, and if she can get the courts to comply with her request before November, well, then that helps her perhaps in exacting revenge.
Yeah, okay. Let's change topics a second and go back, or go to this latest round of ads that we have seen put forth. I'm speaking here of the TV ads that have been aired by the Pritzker campaign. I stand corrected. The Rauner campaign against J.B. Pritzker. Unedited wiretaps with the would-be governor talking to the former disgraced governor, Rod Blagojevich. Why in the heck would Rauner do that now? I mean, he's not running against Pritzker or any other Democrat right now. Why is he running a anti-Pritzker ad at this point in time?
Well, the only insight I can give you is that there is a strong sense in the Rauner campaign that the Pritzker campaign was driving much of the media focus and attention on the Legionnaires scandal. And so it's no surprise to most people close to this story that the very first action the Rauner campaign took within moments of the governor sort of putting a bow on the Legionnaires' Quincy story, that his campaign hits back in essence. And this was a very personal story for the governor. I think he felt grieved and insulted that he would be attacked for this veterans home story. And so whether it's fair or not, my sense would be, this is just from conversations with the Rauner campaign, that they probably hit back thinking this was a way to, whether some people have speculated he's trying to get involved in the Democratic primary campaign. I think that's misguided. I think the governor's campaign is hitting back at this veteran story.
So this is just payback time then. This is, and I guess one question that I have, it was a fairly damning ad. I mean, nobody really wants to be caught on tape talking to Rod Blagojevich about anything, let alone the possibility about being appointed Attorney General. How damaging is this sort of stuff to Pritzker? And does it raise the question, if they let this out now, what else might they have in store for the general?
You know, when the initial tape came out last summer, I was surprised that it didn't get that much attention. Now, of course, we were dealing with a massive budget crisis and school funding and whatever else was happening last summer. It was insane. But this is, it's not great. It's not great for J.B. Pritzker. You know, he is caught on tape, you know, not exactly saying, yes, I want this, because the Governor Blagojevich was definitely driving the conversation.
Sure.
But he's, you know, caught agreeing.
But Pritzker wasn't saying, no, that would be wrong.
No, he's definitely not saying that. He'd say, oh, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Well, there's also more than one phone call, and that's important because he didn't just hang up the phone and never call him back.
Right.
He called him back several times and then tried to steer the conversation toward, I don't want the AG spot, I don't want the senator's seat, I want the treasurer's job. And he bent the governor's ear several times in that direction, angling for the treasurer's spot. So there are more damaging ads. There's an 11-minute compilation that the Tribune released of all these tapes back and forth, and the one that the Rauner campaign just released is probably a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10 of how damaging it was, in contrast to what some of the other recordings have in store. So this is, of the recordings, it's only going to get worse.
Sure, and I mean, this has been no secret this was going to happen, even before Pritzker entered the race. The Republicans had sent robocalls to donors and to Democratic Party officials of Blagojevich on tape, I believe, with a top aide talking about Pritzker wanting to become AG. Don't tell anybody that. And you read the transcript of it, and you don't know really whether Blagojevich is just making this up in terms of Pritzker's alleged interest in the AG spot or not. But again, before Pritzker ever announced for office, the GOP made it clear that this is going to be an issue for you if you choose to run.
Your question was, you know, why wet your ammo now, or whatever the expression is. I'm not super familiar with guns, but
powder dry.
Okay, sure. Why release this now? But I think that, you know, like Mark said, there's a treasure trove for Republicans. You know, last time around they had, you know, new Bruce Rauner's money, and that was exciting for them, and it has looked not so great for the governor's re-election chances. You know, he's been named pretty vulnerable. But this is something huge for the Republican Party in Illinois, because Rod Blagojevich is not going to go away. He's a stain on the Illinois Democratic Party, and he will remain to be for years and years, even though it's been, you know, 9 years since he was arrested.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's also a bit, I think, disingenuous that the Pritzker campaign says, well, the Rauner campaign is trying to play politics and get involved by attacking us and get involved in a primary. What was the Rauner campaign supposed to do? Sit there quietly and just take the shots from the Pritzker campaign for months, almost a year now, about 8, 9, 10 months. The Pritzker campaign has been unloading on Rauner every day, and the Rauner campaign is supposed to wait until March 21st to get involved in that fight. I think they've been itching. They've been building up their staff. They've been researching, and they've been waiting really to start launching some of their ammo. And if you're looking at shots fired, this is like 1 compared to 100. So in terms of who's hitting who early, of course the governor has a primary challenger in Jeannie Ives, the Republican there, but everybody expects the governor to be on the ballot in November. And so yes, there may be some of the governor expecting that JB is the presumptive nominee for the Democrats. And it's also true. This may breathe some life into the campaigns for Senator Biss and for Chris Kennedy if they can drag down polling for J.B. Pritzker.
Are they willing to do that? Are they willing to you call it the high road, the low road, let's call it the Blago road. Are they willing to go the Blagojevich road against Pritzker? Should they?
Who, the primary? The
Yeah,
primary?
Biss and Kennedy.
Can they afford to on air is the question.
Okay.
Are they willing to in forums where they're speaking publicly? Absolutely. I think the strategy for Chris Kennedy has been a bit different. The strategy for for Senator Biss might align more with that because Biss has been more specific at the power structures that exist in Madigan and the relationships, whereas Kennedy has been more policy, property tax issues, economy, and gun violence. So they have different paths to victory in their own minds and different strategies that they've shown us so far. But yeah, it's not out of the question that Biss or Kennedy might open up and try to exploit that Blagojevich and Pritzker connection at some point.
Sure. I mean, Biss just recently admitted, hey, I made a mistake in 2013 when I voted for this pension reform bill, because he used the word, I think, hysteria or something of that
Mass
nature.
hysteria.
Yeah, mass hysteria. I mean, what kind of an admission is that for a gubernatorial candidate to make? And he wasn't forced to do it, really. I mean, why would you come up and say something like that? How damaging is it? Or does it help you in some way, shape, or form?
Pretty novel, I would say. You know, it's novel for any politician ever to admit fault or, responsibility.
Or to be honest.
Yeah, sure.
Should
But
have fixed those pipes earlier.
Dan Biss was on, if I'm recalling correctly, I think I am, he was on the conference committee that negotiated the pension bill in 2013. He, to say it was a mistake, to say he was caught up in hysteria, I mean, I guess, but I'm not sure. I mean, I guess, he's trying to, as hard as he can, to push for his progressive credentials, which he pretty much has. But, that voting for the pension bill, being part of crafting it, is a stain on that record. So I guess, being a regular guy who admits stuff and who wants to be as progressive as possible, that's the thing he came up with, and it's interesting.
But you never really want to be the standard bearer for the lemming party. But that said, we are out of time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week on Capitol View.